It started with laughter and ended in a silence that cut deeper than a blade. The mercenaries had their prisoner cuffed, stripped of weapons, his face bruised and bloody from a rough capture that had felt too easy. They paraded him through their ship's corridors like a trophy, hollering bets on how much their client would pay for a live human. One mercenary draped an old, torn earth flag over the captive's shoulders and mocked him with a crooked salute, while another snatched the battered dog tags that hung from his neck, twisting them in the dim light and sneering. The prisoner's lips barely moved as he finally spoke, and his quiet words crawled straight into their bones. "You should have checked the code before you touched me." In that instant the bravado evaporated. No one laughed now. The dog tags weren't just metal. They were a warning. Vaktharan, the grizzled leader of this ragged band of galactic mercenaries, had been eager to finish this job. The contract had come through encrypted channels from a powerful, anonymous client, promising a small fortune for one objective: capture a lone human operative in the Drift Expanse. The data file had described him as a stranded civilian, a nobody. Vok hadn't even bothered reading the full contract. To him this had been an easy payday, the kind that let him and his crew waste time betting on who would be the first to land a punch or snatch a souvenir. They loved Earth bounties. Humans begged. Humans wept. Humans broke quickly. It was entertainment as much as work. But the prisoner they had caught didn't beg or weep or break. From the moment they closed the collar around his neck, he simply watched, calm and disturbingly quiet. One of the younger mercenaries joked that this one must have frozen from fear. Another bet 10 credits that he'd start crying before they reached the ship. But he didn't cry. He didn't even flinch. Vok chalked it up to shock. It made no difference. They had dragged him aboard the Red Talon, locked him in the brig, and the crew celebrated like they had captured a senator's daughter. Music blared in the galley. Cards slapped the table. Beer cans hissed open. They laughed and reenacted his capture in exaggerated pantomime, mimicking his stoic face and blank expression. One crewman even mocked his small frame, saying he looked like a bureaucrat more than a soldier. Back in the brig, however, the air felt colder. The prisoner sat alone on the metal bench, his head down, seemingly defeated. A security camera in the corner flickered once and stabilized. The guards posted outside leaned against the wall, half-drunk and careless. No one expected trouble from a silent, cuffed human. Then one of them, Gareth, decided to have a little fun and barged into the cell. He grabbed the human by the chin and sneered in his face. "What's your name, runt? Say something. Say you're sorry for wasting our time." The human slowly lifted his eyes and locked them onto Gareth's with unnerving calm. He didn't speak yet. He simply tilted his head and let his gaze rest on the mercenary's belt where the keycard hung loosely. Gareth followed that gaze, confused, chuckled, and reached down to tug his keycard as if to taunt him further. It was then that the other guard noticed the dog tags hanging loosely around the human's neck. The tags had been overlooked during the rough capture, assumed to be a relic of some broken past. But curiosity got the better of the guard and he snatched them up, squinting at the inscription. His face paled instantly. He didn't say a word at first, but his hand began to tremble and the keycard fell from Gareth's belt with a clatter. The tag didn't display a name. It displayed a series of characters few had seen in real life but every soldier, mercenary, and pirate had heard whispered on dark channels: Omega GH09. A cold sweat broke across the guard's forehead. His voice cracked as he muttered, "Captain, you might want to see this." The announcement came through the comm system, interrupting the laughter in the galley. Vaktharan tapped his communicator angrily. "What is it?" "We're celebrating." "Did he wet himself already?" The guard's terrified voice answered, "No, sir, you need to come to the brig. Now." Vok sighed, slammed his drink down, and stomped toward the brig, his boots echoing down the metal corridors. He pushed open the door and stepped inside just as the human finally spoke. "You really should have checked the code before you touched me." Vok froze as he recognized the unit designation hanging from that tag. Ghosts. A word almost mythical among warlords and mercenaries. Earth's most ruthless covert operators, men and women who didn't exist on any official records and who never left missions unfinished. Every story about them ended the same way, in silence. The prisoner lifted his head fully for the first time and smiled. It wasn't a smile of surrender. It was a smile of a predator who had just lured his prey into a perfect trap. In that moment, the lights flickered. The security system let out a faint whine. The doors behind Vox sealed with an audible thud, trapping them all inside. Vox's heart began to race for the first time in years. The human hadn't been captured. He had infiltrated. This wasn't a bounty. It was bait. Back in the galley, the celebration continued, oblivious to the shift in the air. A few mercs noticed the flickering lights but waved it off. Just ship glitches, they laughed. Nothing to worry about. But inside the brig, the mood had turned deadly. The prisoner flexed his wrists, and the cuffs snapped open with a quiet click. He stretched slowly, as if warming up for a job he knew would take time. His eyes locked onto Vox. The mercenary leader felt his bravado crumbling as fear took hold. The prisoner spoke again, soft but clear, his words dripping with quiet amusement. "It's going to be a long night, Captain. Better pour yourself another drink." Vox reached instinctively for his sidearm but realized, too late, that it was no longer there. It was in the prisoner's hand now, pointed casually at his chest. The guards outside finally realized something was wrong as the ship's alarms began blaring. This was no stranded human. This was an Omega ghost. And they had just invited a ghost onto their ship. Panic spread like wildfire through the corridors of the Red Talon as the alarms wailed, their shrill cry rising above the drunken shouting in the galley. Mercenaries who had been laughing a minute ago now fumbled for weapons, their grins dissolving into expressions of confusion and fear. They didn't understand what was happening yet, but instinct told them something had gone horribly wrong. In the brig, Vox stood frozen, staring down the barrel of his own pistol, the human's finger resting lightly on the trigger. For a moment no one moved. Then, with a flick of the prisoner's wrist, the pistol flipped around grip first, and he held it out to Vox, a faint smirk on his face as if daring him to take it back. Vox hesitated, then reached slowly for the weapon. Just as his fingers brushed the grip, the human let it drop, clattering to the floor. Vox lunged for it, but a boot pinned it instantly. The human tilted his head, watching Vox struggle beneath him like a predator watching weak prey exhaust itself. "You should have checked the code before you touched me," he repeated, almost gently, and then he was gone, slipping into the shadows at the edge of the cell before anyone could stop him. In the hallway outside, the guards had drawn their weapons but didn't know where to aim. The lights above them flickered and dimmed as if the ship itself was reacting to some unseen force. Doors that should have remained sealed began sliding open and shut, seemingly at random. Vox stormed out of the brig, his face pale and furious, barking orders to regroup and sweep the ship. His voice cracked as he shouted at his crew to find the human, to hunt him down, to seal off engineering and communications before the prisoner could cause more damage. But deep down Vox knew it was already too late. The moment he had recognized that unit code on the dog tags, he knew exactly what kind of nightmare he had brought aboard. This wasn't some lost refugee or rogue soldier. This was an Omega ghost, one of Earth's shadow operatives, a man trained not just to kill but to dismantle entire organizations from within. And worst of all, this one had let himself be captured. The crew split into small teams, moving cautiously through the dim corridors. They were hardened mercenaries, but their discipline was fraying. Their usual bravado had vanished. Every creak of metal, every flicker of light made them jump. Gareth, the same merc who had grabbed the prisoner's face in the brig, now clutched his plasma rifle tightly, sweat pouring down his neck. He tried to steady his breathing but his nerves betrayed him. He turned a corner with two others at his side and froze. The weapons rack that had been bolted to the wall earlier was empty. Worse, one grenade was missing. The realization struck him too late. A faint metallic clink sounded behind them, a sound every soldier dreads. The pin. Before they could react, the blast knocked them all into the wall, searing heat and smoke filling the passage. Gareth felt his ears ringing and the world spinning as he slid down the bulkhead, coughing and gasping. When he looked up, the human was gone. Elsewhere, another team moved cautiously into the cargo bay. They found the room strangely untouched, but the silence was unnerving. Stacks of crates loomed like tombstones in the flickering light. One mercenary, a tall brute named Crass, crept forward and reached out to open a crate. As soon as he lifted the lid, a blinding flash filled the room, followed by a deafening concussive blast. Flash bangs. Not one, but dozens packed into the crate, rigged to go off together. The mercenaries reeled, temporarily blinded and deafened, stumbling into each other, their weapons clattering to the floor. Somewhere in the chaos, they heard it, a calm voice over the ship's comm system, distorted but clear. "You caught a ghost, boys. I hope you're ready to pay the price." Vok heard the message too, and his blood ran cold. He knew that phrase, that taunt. It was standard protocol for Omega Ghost operatives when they were cornered, a signal that their mission objectives had shifted from evasion to elimination. From this point forward, the human wasn't just escaping. He was hunting them. Vok barked into his comm, ordering all hands to fall back to the bridge, to regroup and lock down the ship's systems. But even as he gave the order, a cold realization settled in his gut. The human had already started controlling the ship. The glitches weren't random. They were deliberate. The doors were locking according to his movements. The lights were failing where he passed. The air vents and conduits were bending to his will. Somehow, with nothing but his own implants and knowledge of ship systems, he was turning the Red Talon into his personal hunting ground. In the galley, a handful of mercenaries remained, still drunk but sobering fast as the alarms continued to wail. One of them, a wiry technician named Rin, pulled up the ship's internal cams on a small monitor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder. But every feed was corrupted. Static blurred every camera. Then, slowly, the static cleared on one screen, showing a close-up of the prisoner's face. He was smiling. Then, in an instant, the image changed to the camera feed from inside the galley itself. The mercenaries stared in horror as they realized they were being watched. The screen went black and all the doors to the galley slammed shut. The lights died completely, leaving them in pitch darkness. Throughout the ship, fear had become palpable. Mercenaries who had once mocked Earth soldiers now trembled in corners, clutching weapons they no longer trusted. Their numbers were dwindling fast, and no one could say exactly how many had vanished or where their bodies might be. Vok gritted his teeth, moving quickly toward the bridge with his remaining loyalists. He needed control back, but control was already slipping through his fingers. The human had turned their confidence against them, using their own routines, their own trust in their security systems, their own arrogance to dismantle them piece by piece. In the chaos, the prisoner moved unseen, slipping through maintenance ducts and hidden passages he seemed to know better than the crew themselves. Every step he took was calculated. Every trap he left behind was deliberate. And with each passing minute, the Red Talon felt less like their ship and more like his lair. The mercenaries hadn't captured a prize. They had invited death aboard. And death was smiling. Vok's boots pounded against the deck as he rushed toward the bridge, the few remaining mercenaries scrambling behind him. The cold metal corridors that had once felt like home now seemed hostile, every shadow thick with threat, every flickering light a reminder that the human they thought they had captured was still out there, watching, waiting. The fear was raw now. The bravado and arrogance that had filled the ship just hours before had drained away, leaving a crew of hardened killers reduced to paranoid wrecks. Vok's orders came rapid fire but with diminishing authority. His voice, once barked with absolute command, now cracked with anxiety as he shouted at his crew to lock down systems, sweep every corridor, check every hatch. But the human had already taken control of the rhythm aboard the Red Talon. The ship no longer felt like theirs. A mercenary named Kale, lean and scarred, kept pace with Vok, his rifle shaking slightly in his hands. He glanced down at his wrist comm where a digital map of the ship's layout flickered erratically. Something was wrong with the map. Rooms appeared where there were none. Corridors twisted impossibly, paths leading back on themselves. Even the schematic they relied on for navigation was corrupted, warped by the prisoners' interference. Kale hesitated as he came to a junction and looked at Vok for guidance. The captain hesitated too. He could not admit aloud that he was just as lost now as his men. Instead, he waved them down the left passage, his decision based on nothing but desperation. Every footstep echoed unnervingly loud, like a drumbeat counting down to their inevitable encounter. Somewhere behind them, the sound of metal striking metal rang out sharply, a clang that sent a jolt through the nervous group. They spun as one, rifles raised, eyes darting, but the corridor behind them was empty. The lights above them dimmed further, casting long shadows along the walls. The prisoner had anticipated their every move. He was guiding them now, herding them like animals toward a destination of his choosing. Vok's heart pounded as he felt the walls closing in around them, but he forced himself forward, deeper into the trap. At that same moment, in engineering, two mercenaries named Rahl and Jex tried to reboot the ship's security systems manually. They worked furiously over a console, sweat beading on their foreheads as they typed override commands and attempted to purge the corrupt software. Jex muttered curses under his breath, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to move at the edges of his vision. They thought they had sealed the engineering bay behind them, but they were wrong. The human was already inside. As Jex leaned down to check a power relay, a gloved hand reached out from beneath the console and yanked his ankle hard, pulling him into the darkness with a muffled cry. Rahl barely had time to turn before he felt the cold steel of a combat knife press against his throat. The prisoner's voice was right next to his ear, soft and terrifying in its calm. "I told you this was my ship now." A gunshot echoed through the ship, distant but unmistakable. Vok's team froze again, glancing at each other with growing dread. They knew they were being hunted, picked off one by one, but there was nothing they could do to stop it. One mercenary, a bulky brute named Drog, cracked a weak joke about ghosts in the dark, but even he couldn't force a laugh. His eyes were wide and wild. The tension was unbearable now. Their enemy was invisible, silent, and terrifyingly precise. They had fought pirates and rebels before, but this was something altogether different. This was surgical. This was personal. As they rounded another corner, they found a grim sight waiting for them. Two more of their crew were slumped against the bulkhead, their rifles gone, their helmets missing. But they weren't dead. They were unconscious, bound with their own gear, and on their foreheads, a single phrase had been scrawled in blood-red paint: Ghost Exfiltration. The message was unmistakable. The prisoner was playing with them now, demonstrating his complete control over their environment. He could have killed them all already if he wanted to, but he didn't. He was enjoying this. He was savoring their fear. The bridge door finally came into sight, a heavy blast door that represented the last secure point on the ship. Vok rushed forward, swiping his keycard frantically against the panel. The door refused to open at first, denying access as if mocking him. Then, with a quiet chime, it slid open smoothly. But inside, the bridge was dark, eerily quiet. The main console glowed dimly in standby mode, and no crew remained at their posts. Chairs were empty, screens flickered with static, and the faint smell of burnt wiring hung in the air. The captain's chair sat at the center, and on the seat, laid neatly, were three objects: Vok's personal sidearm, a severed communication cable, and a single dog tag identical to the one around the prisoner's neck. The implication was clear. The prisoner had already been here. He had already won. Vok swallowed hard, backing away from the chair, his mind racing. His remaining crew huddled behind him, unsure whether to take defensive positions or run. They had no idea where to run to. Every corridor felt compromised. Every hatch felt like a trap. The ship felt like a maze designed by their enemy. They were no longer the hunters. They were prey. Vok turned to issue new orders, but before he could speak, the bridge door slammed shut behind them, locking with a hiss. The lights died completely, plunging them into pitch blackness. Then the voice came over the speakers again, calm and composed, as if narrating a story that only he controlled. "Welcome to your last stand, Captain. I suggest you make it memorable. Vok's breath caught in his throat. He realized now what they all had missed from the beginning. The bounty had never been about capturing this human. It had been about luring them into a trap of their own arrogance. Their client hadn't wanted a prisoner. The client had wanted them eliminated. And they had delivered themselves, gift-wrapped and helpless, right into their enemies' hands. The crew on the bridge raised their rifles and pointed them toward every dark corner, spinning in circles, panic overtaking reason. Every shadow felt alive. Every creak of metal sent them into fresh terror. They knew now that they weren't going to escape. This was a slaughterhouse, and the prisoner was the butcher, patient and precise, cutting them down not with brute force but with fear and precision. In the suffocating darkness, Vok felt something brush against his shoulder and spun wildly, firing a burst into the shadows. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the bridge, revealing nothing but terrified faces and empty consoles. When the darkness returned, so did the voice, soft and chilling. Ghosts don't die, Captain. They erase. And Vok finally understood. This wasn't a man they had caught. This was a ghost, and the red talon was already his tomb. The bridge remained cloaked in an oppressive darkness, the only illumination coming from the occasional flicker of dying consoles casting ghostly shadows across the terrified faces of Vok's crew. Their once proud mercenary unit, known throughout the drift expanse for ruthlessness and efficiency, was now reduced to trembling figures huddled behind overturned chairs and console panels, rifles shaking in their sweaty hands. Each of them knew instinctively that the human they had captured was no ordinary prisoner. They had stumbled onto a nightmare carefully designed to play out exactly like this, where they were not soldiers hunting a fugitive but targets being dismantled methodically. And the worst part was that their enemy was nowhere to be seen. No footsteps, no gunfire, no shouts from a charging attacker. Just silence broken only by their own ragged breathing and the occasional, taunting distortion of the human's voice over the comms. Ghosts don't die, Captain. They erase. Vok crouched behind his command console, gripping the sidearm he had recovered earlier, though he knew it was pointless. His thoughts raced, but every plan he could imagine crumbled under the weight of the realization that the ship itself was no longer theirs. Their security codes had failed, the schematics they depended on were corrupted, and every corridor felt like a maze designed to confuse and isolate them. He had underestimated the human from the very beginning, dismissing him as a stranded civilian without even bothering to read the full bounty contract. Now, too late, he understood that he had delivered himself and his crew into a perfect ambush. This was not a fugitive. This was an Omega Ghost, the most feared designation any human operative could carry, and worse, this one was enjoying the slow unraveling of his prey. In the dark, a sudden hiss of hydraulics sounded near the rear bulkhead, followed by a cold rush of air as the emergency hatch cracked open ever so slightly. A ripple of panic surged through the crew as they swung their rifles toward the noise, half expecting the human to appear in the doorway. But no one came. Instead, one by one, the overhead lights in the bridge flickered back on, not at full brightness but dim and flickering, creating a strobe effect that made every movement seem erratic and sinister. It was another game, another psychological tactic designed to keep them teetering on the edge of panic and exhaustion. One of the mercenaries, a young recruit named Mace, finally broke. He sprinted toward the exit, screaming that he was getting out, that he would rather die running than wait for the ghost to strike. But before he could reach the door, it slid shut violently and locked with a metallic clunk. In that same instant, a thin cloud of white mist began seeping from vents near the floor, curling around their boots. Mace froze and then coughed, looking around wildly as the mist thickened. Vok recognized it immediately. Knockout gas. The human wasn't even wasting ammunition. He was simply suffocating them slowly, forcing them to panic and make mistakes. Vok shouted for the crew to hold their breath, to find masks, but it was already too late. Most of their emergency supplies had been stored in compartments that were now locked or empty, another detail the prisoner had accounted for. The mercenaries began to cough and stagger, some firing blindly into the shadows, others collapsing to their knees as the gas dulled their senses and sent their thoughts spinning. One by one, They dropped their weapons and fell unconscious, until only Vok remained crouched behind his console, holding a torn cloth over his mouth and nose in a futile attempt to filter the air. The voice came again, this time softer, almost conversational, but laced with a venomous amusement. "You should have read the contract, Captain." Vok's vision blurred as the gas worked its way through his system, and he found himself slumping against the console, his grip loosening on the pistol. As his eyelids grew heavy, he realized that this was not the end for him. Not yet. The human didn't want him dead. He wanted him awake. There was more humiliation to endure, more fear to feel. This was a lesson, a message that would outlive this crew and this ship. When Vok awoke, the gas had cleared and the bridge lights were steady again. But something was different. He was alone now. The bodies of his crew were gone. No blood, no sign of struggle, just silence and absence. He rose unsteadily, every nerve on fire, and approached the main console. A single message blinked in red text across the display. "Transmission pending?" Curious despite himself, Vok touched the screen, and a recorded video began to play. It showed the cargo hold, empty at first but then slowly filling as the camera panned across rows of his unconscious crew members. They were all neatly restrained, their weapons removed, positioned with military precision. Then the camera zoomed in on a crate labeled Earth Defense Command. Vok's stomach twisted. He realized what the next phase was. The voice returned, this time directly into the bridge speakers, loud and clear. "You delivered them right on time, Captain. The bounty wasn't for me. It was for them." Vok's heart sank as the realization hit him fully. The contract he had so arrogantly accepted had been a setup from the beginning, a contract not for a capture but for a delivery. Earth hadn't wanted the human caught. Earth had wanted the mercenary crew themselves brought to them, alive but helpless, gift-wrapped by their own leader's arrogance. The final insult came moments later. The escape pods on the bridge suddenly activated, their launch sequence flashing green. The main screen displayed a countdown timer and a destination, Earth Defense Command Black Site 9. His crew would be delivered straight to Earth's most secure prison complex. And as for him, Vok turned slowly to see the human finally standing behind him, fully armed now, dressed in scavenged mercenary gear but wearing those battered dog tags like a trophy. The human said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was victory enough. Vok sank to his knees, the weight of his failure crushing him. The prisoner stepped forward, reached out calmly, and tapped the launch control. The escape pods ejected one by one, streaking away from the red talon, carrying Vok's crew to their final fate. Then the human leaned down, his face inches from Vok's. "Checkmate, Captain," he whispered, and with a final, almost casual gesture, he stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Vok remained kneeling, broken and alone, the bridge lights steady now but no comfort at all. His ship was silent, empty, and conquered, and he knew that this was only the beginning of a larger game he had never understood. Vok remained kneeling long after the last escape pod had launched, his mind a swirling mess of fear, shame, and disbelief. His ship, the pride of his fleet and the heart of his reputation, was now hollow and silent, emptied of his crew, stripped of its power, and claimed by a single man. The Red Talon, once the hunter of the drift expanse, was now a tomb floating in the cold dark void. Every moment of bravado that had brought him here played back in his mind like cruel echoes, the laughter of his crew, the scorn they had thrown at the silent prisoner, the careless arrogance with which they had chained him and paraded him through the corridors. All of it had been part of the trap, a performance carefully staged by their so-called captive, who had let himself be taken simply so he could destroy them from within. The human had moved through his ship like a shadow, not just killing but dismantling, not just escaping but humiliating. As Vok struggled to rise, he noticed something on the command console. A small blinking icon at the corner of the screen, subtle but unmistakable. It was a transmission request, routed through encrypted channels, labeled simply as report. The bounty contract had included a completion clause. He was supposed to report success. He almost laughed, a dry, bitter sound that barely escaped his cracked lips. What success could he possibly report now? His crew was gone, his ship hijacked, and the man they were meant to capture had turned out to be a nightmare from Earth's darkest legends. But something deeper stirred in Vok, a last flicker of survival instinct. He reached out with a trembling hand and accepted the transmission. The main screen came to life, and the face that appeared on it chilled him even more than the events that had unfolded aboard his ship. It was a human officer, dressed in an Earth defense uniform but without insignia. His face was clean-shaven, cold, and expressionless, his eyes sharp and unreadable. He studied Vok through the screen as if inspecting a specimen. "Captain Vokthran," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless, "you have fulfilled your contract exactly as intended." Vok opened his mouth to speak, to ask what this all meant, but no words came out. The officer continued before he could gather himself. "The man you and your crew attempted to capture is not merely an operative. He is an Omega Ghost, one of Earth's last remaining assets of his kind. The contract you accepted was not for him. It was for your crew." Vok felt the truth crash down on him fully now. His crew's capture had always been the objective. He and his mercenaries had been marked for elimination, not by guns but by manipulation, by allowing their own greed and arrogance to blind them. The officer's gaze hardened slightly as he spoke again. "Your crew is now in our custody. Their records, weapons, and knowledge will be extracted and used. As for you, Captain, you will serve one final purpose." Vok's throat tightened as he asked, in a voice hoarse and cracked from fear and despair, "What purpose?" The officer leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You will remain on that ship, exactly as you are now. We have scrubbed your ship's beacon codes. From this moment on, the Red Talon is considered lost in the drift expanse. You will drift alone until the ship decays or you die, whichever comes first. Your reputation will crumble, your name will be forgotten, and any who come searching will find only an empty husk. That is your reward for your service." The screen went dark, leaving Vok staring at his own hollow reflection. His breath came in ragged gasps as the enormity of his punishment sank in. He had become a ghost himself now, a prisoner aboard his own ship, condemned to a slow, lonely death. And the man who had engineered it all, the quiet human they had mocked and abused, had vanished without a trace, leaving only his legacy behind. But before Vok could even attempt to formulate a plan, a soft noise behind him made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, calm. The human was still aboard. Vok turned, his eyes wide and desperate, and saw him standing just inside the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a long moment they stared at each other in silence, the predator and the broken captain. Then the human spoke, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "I'm not finished yet." Vok's heart thudded in his chest as the human stepped forward, retrieving a small device from his belt and placing it on the console. The device flickered and projected a holographic image of the entire drift expanse, dotted with red markers. Mercenary outposts, pirate enclaves, black market stations, all known associates of Vok's crew. The human met his gaze and smiled faintly. "Your friends will wonder what happened to you. They'll send others. I intend to greet them." Vok realized in that moment that this wasn't just about punishing him. This was about using him, about turning him into bait. The Red Talon would drift, its distress beacon silent, but its absence would not go unnoticed. Sooner or later, someone would come searching, looking for answers, for salvage, for vengeance. And when they did, they would find the ghost still waiting. The human stepped back into the shadows, blending with them so completely that it was as if he had never been there. Vok fell to his knees again, head bowed, tears of frustration and terror streaking down his face. His ship was a tomb, and he was its warden, trapped in a nightmare that would never end. All his plans, his ambitions, his legacy, all undone by a man he had thought was weak, powerless, and defeated. Outside, the stars spun slowly as the Red Talon drifted into deep space, its engines cold and dead. Inside, Vok sat alone, haunted by the knowledge that every second of his downfall had been orchestrated by a master who had never needed to fire a shot until it was already too late. And somewhere in the shadows, the human waited patiently for the next ship to come, his mission far from over. The legend of the Omega Ghost would live on, whispered by those who feared the dark, feared the silence, and feared the chilling truth that the deadliest enemies are the ones who smile as they watch you fall. The red Talon drifted in silence, a dark shadow gliding through the cold emptiness of space. Its hull bore the scars of its captain's arrogance, but from the outside there was no sign of what had truly unfolded aboard. Inside, the bridge was a hollow tomb, dimly lit, with consoles flickering weakly and casting pale, uneven light across Vok Theron's gaunt face. Days had passed, or was it weeks? Time had become meaningless in the absence of purpose or control. His crew was gone, the systems barely responded to his desperate attempts to regain control, and the only voice that ever answered was his own hollow echo. The humiliation of his downfall had been carefully crafted, each step orchestrated to dismantle not just his operation but his pride, his identity, his very sense of self. The mercenary captain who had once commanded fear and respect throughout the drift expanse was now reduced to a lone figure mumbling to himself, haunted by shadows. And yet, there were no bodies left. No traces of the prisoner's violence. No signs of overt destruction. The ship was whole and quiet, but its soul had been stolen. Vok would sometimes stand at the viewport, staring into the void, wondering if it would be better to simply step into the airlock and end it. But every time he reached for that release, he remembered the human's final promise before slipping back into the shadows. "I'm not finished yet." Those words gnawed at him, colder than space itself. They carried an implication that this torment wasn't over, that some final humiliation still waited, unseen and inevitable. Then one day, the silence broke. A small light began blinking on the main console, accompanied by a soft chime. Incoming transmission. Vok froze at the sound, unable to comprehend it at first. The systems had been dead, locked down, corrupted. How could there be a transmission? With shaking hands, he approached the console and activated the comms. The screen came to life slowly, lines of static sweeping across it before resolving into an image. A familiar face stared back at him, the same human officer who had spoken to him before. But this time, there was something different in his expression, something colder, more calculating. "Captain Theron," the officer began, "you will prepare for company." Vok blinked in confusion, unsure what the man meant. The officer leaned forward slightly. "As we predicted, your disappearance has raised questions. Your allies, competitors, and enemies have begun to search for you. We expect the first search parties to arrive within the next 2 cycles. His voice remained flat, clinical, as though he was delivering a weather report rather than a death sentence. "You will not resist. You will not warn them. You will allow them aboard, and then you will watch." Vok's breath caught in his throat as he realized the depth of this cruel design. His punishment was not simply exile or isolation. It was to become bait, a lure for every other mercenary crew in the expanse, all drawn to the mystery of his disappearance. And when they arrived, they would walk into the same nightmare, and they too would fall. The Red Talon was now a trap, a ghost ship, designed not to be found but to consume. The officer's face flickered and disappeared, replaced by another message blinking on the console. Docking sequence unlocked. Vok stumbled backward, heart pounding, as the console's systems hummed to life. Somewhere deep in the ship, hatches hissed open and docking clamps adjusted, preparing to receive new guests. His fingers trembled as he realized he was powerless to stop it. The systems no longer obeyed him. The human, the ghost, still controlled everything. It did not take long. The sensors registered the approach of another vessel, small and fast, a typical scavenger ship used by mercenary scouts. Vok recognized the ID signature immediately. They were old rivals, men who had mocked him in life, men who would have delighted in his demise had they found his wreck. And now they were coming, drawn by curiosity, by greed, and by the hope of salvaging a legend. They would come aboard confident and loud, as he himself had done when first capturing the human, oblivious to what waited in the shadows. Vok collapsed into the captain's chair, unable to move. His throat was dry and his heart heavy as the ship's automated systems extended docking arms and began the process of welcoming its next victims. He could almost hear their laughter already, could imagine their sneering faces as they joked about his downfall, unaware that they were moments away from discovering the truth. The ghost had promised this would happen, and he had kept that promise with chilling precision. Even before the new crew boarded, the lights in the corridor dimmed slightly, as if responding to the prisoner's unseen presence. The air felt heavier. Every sound seemed amplified. Somewhere deep in the ship, a maintenance panel creaked open and then slid shut quietly, without any command from Vok. He knew who moved behind those panels, slipping through the veins of the ship unseen, preparing traps and surprises, ready to repeat the same cycle of terror and destruction. This wasn't just vengeance. This was methodical, patient, relentless. The human wasn't merely hunting them. He was turning the Red Talon into a legend, a story that would spread like wildfire through the galactic underworld, a ship that swallowed crews whole, a place where arrogant hunters became desperate prey. As the first footsteps echoed through the airlock, Vok let his head fall into his hands. He couldn't warn them even if he wanted to. The human had locked him out of the comms. His voice was useless, his authority shattered. All he could do was listen as they made their way through the ship, laughing and jeering, their weapons drawn but their minds relaxed. They thought they were in control. They thought they were predators. But in a few short hours, they would understand the truth. The ghost never left. He was still here, patient and methodical, waiting for every arrogant mercenary who thought they could claim the prize. And as Vok sat in silence, he realized that this would go on forever. The Red Talon would become a myth, whispered in bars and back alleys, feared even by the most ruthless pirates. Every crew that came searching would be consumed, one after another, feeding the legend and feeding the ghost's quiet war. Vok himself would remain a prisoner not just in body but in history, his name forever tied to the trap he had built with his own pride. And somewhere, in the shadows between decks, the human watched it all unfold, calm and silent, smiling faintly as his mission continued.